Kim Lane Scheppele. She's a professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University, and she is going to tell me and you why we should be paying attention to the nation of Hungary and why that is on her mind and should be on our minds these days. Professor Scheppele, how are you?
Okay, except that we've got this election coming up and we're all anxious.
I know. I was saying earlier, I said, like, today is supposed to be the scariest day of the year, but to me, I think next Tuesday is going to be the scariest day of the year.
Yeah. So I think we're all there.
Yep. So I'm going to ask you to give me a Hungary 101 lesson because, like a lot of Americans, I am fixated on American politics, and I know that Viktor Orbán is an authoritarian, autocratic leader in Hungary and is someone who is greatly admired by the American political right. But I don't know much about Orbán or Hungary, to be honest. I know a landlocked country over there, and so I'm bringing you on here to educate me about Hungary and why we should be paying particular attention to it these days.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm glad you're asking that question. And I think the first thing to say is that, there was a time back when Democrats and social, sort of progressives in the U.S. used to think that Sweden was just a great model, And I think what's happened on the right in the U.S. is that they've decided that Hungary is a great model for the same reason. It's a small country that actually manages to pull off the kind of ideal that they're seeking in politics. And so, I think it's crucial to understand what it is that they are seeing there and how it is that actually what's happening in Hungary is coming back to bite the U.S. It's not just a foreign policy issue again, because it turns out that Orbán and his people are deeply involved in structuring the next Trump administration, if there is one. Orbán and his people were involved in writing Project 2025. They also are involved now in working with other think tanks that are close to Trump to actually design the early days of a next Trump administration. So at some level, Hungary's already here, so they're domestic politics. But let me tell you what happened over there so you understand why it matters that they're here. Should I start with that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so Viktor Orbán came to power in 2010. He looked like, your garden variety conservative. He didn't look particularly dangerous. He had been prime minister over in Hungary once before and, had governed in a conservative but not totally irresponsible manner. So when he was elected in 2010, it didn't look like a disaster was about to happen. But it turns out that while Orbán had been out of power, he had his party had hired a bunch of law firms, and they had written out a plan for governance. Think Project 2025. And what Orbán did was to design thousands of pages of laws that if he won the election, he could just shovel through the parliament. It's so quickly that people couldn't even tell what was happening. And so when he came to power, the accidents of the Hungarian election system meant that even though he got 53% of the vote, he got 68% of the seats in the parliament in a country where a single two-thirds vote of the single-chamber parliament was enough to change the Constitution.
So 68 is just enough. Right.
Just enough. So, but the point was it put him above the law, and he had all these laws.
Did he get that majority through gerrymandering, what we would call gerrymandering, or how does that work if you just get 52%?
So he won the first election kind of fair and square by the rules that were in place at the time. And, in fact, we see this with a lot of autocrats coming to power around the world, that the first election they win fair and square. And then if they get to stay there, they try to rig the subsequent elections, which is exactly what Orbán's done. So he rewrote the election laws, and nobody really has been able to oust him ever since because he rigged the rules, essentially, to stay in office. And every time it looks like some challenger might rise up and beat him, he changes the rules to foil that adversary, right? So there is this, Orbán has demonstrated how it is that you never have to have another free and fair election again, something we often hear on this side. Trump saying. So I think the Republicans are fascinated with how he did that, just to stay there.
Well, okay, can you tell me a little bit? Can you tell me a little bit about the Hungarian system? I mean, do they have a constitution like ours? Do they run their elections similar to ours? It's ostensibly a democracy, right?
Well, it was. I lived there for much of the 1990s. At the time, Hungary had just emerged from Soviet control. They drafted a new constitution that went into effect actually 2 weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall. They had this powerful constitutional court. They were really considered the model new democracy that came out from the Soviet space. And, they were the poster child for how democracy can work. Now, they have a system that's different from ours, which is why it was easier for Orbán to capture it quickly. So nobody else gets to say anything about what happens in Hungary but Orbán. They have a parliamentary system, which means that the parliament elects the prime minister. So there isn't a separate election. You don't actually vote for Orbán. You vote for parliament, and then they elect the prime minister.
It's the way we
also different.
Yeah, it's the way we used to elect senators, I think, in the U.S., right?
The way the state legislatures would elect senators, yeah. But there's a difference, like in a presidential system like ours. Congress is elected separately from the president, and you can very often get a Congress that's of a different party, one or both houses or a different party than the president. In a parliamentary system, you're kind of guaranteed that the parliament will always support the executive, because the parliament elects the executive, So it's a system of kind of fused executive and legislative powers, which means that, the parliament is a kind of can be a rubber stamp for what the prime minister wants. And it's worse in Hungary than in most places, because Hungary only has one chamber of the parliament. So, imagine Congress with no Senate. That's what you've got in Hungary. So the most powerful thing to create checks and balances was a very powerful court. So think our Supreme Court, theirs was even more powerful. So when Orbán came to power in 2010, the first thing he did was pack that court. This may also sound slightly familiar from Trump's first term, because the first thing he did, pack the court, right?
Well, my understanding of the term "pack the court" it comes from the Roosevelt years, where they were talking about expanding the number of judges. Is that what he did?
Well, actually, Orbán also did that. But the crucial thing was to capture the nominations process so that you can get your folks onto the court. And, of course, what happened in Hungary was they expanded the jurisdiction of the court, so it had a lot more cases. And then they said, gee, now we need to add more judges. And so in the process of doing that, they managed to put on it loyalists to the party who were, in fact, going to ignore the Constitution and just vote the way the party wanted them to vote. Now, in the U.S., it didn't happen by expanding the number of judges, but it did happen by sort of capturing two judgeships that would normally have been filled by the opposition party. And so it might as well have been that they just expanded the number of judges, because they captured, in Trump's first term, he got 3 appointments, which is really unusual among U.S. presidents. But, as you know, they did that by postponing a judge that Obama should have been able to name, and then quickly speeding up and naming a judge before Biden had a chance.
Yeah, no.
So that's what I mean by packing. It's like changing the rules of the game so that you get your folks onto the court in a way you wouldn't have been able to if you hadn't fiddled with the rules.
So we are looking at a possibility that we will have in Donald Trump, if he's reelected, we will have another Viktor Orbán. I want to talk more about what that could mean, what Orbán's political philosophy is, and what Project 2025 would lay out for the future of the country if, God forbid, Donald Trump is elected president again. I'm going to take a short break. I'm talking to Kim Blaine Scheppele. She's a professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University. We're talking about Hungary and why it's important to pay attention to it. I'm Eric Zorn, sitting in today for Joan Esposito on WCPT AM 820.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, Chicago columnist, writer, and blogger Eric Zorn.
You know, Halloween is supposed to be the scariest day of the year, and so I'm having Kim Lane Scheppele, a professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University, to come on and scare the crap out of us about Hungary and Viktor Orbán and why he's a model for Donald Trump and what might be in store for this country if Donald Trump is reelected and decides to follow the path of Viktor Orbán. Is that possible, Professor Scheppele, that he's going to be able to do a lot of the things that Orbán did or does?
Well, I think he's going to try. So, Orbán and Trump have this in common, which is neither one of them believes much about what they say. They're very transactional, and the key is just staying in power as long as possible. So one of the things that Orbán's done is to perfect a number of ways that any aspiring autocrat can get rid of all the pesky independent authorities that may hold them in check and figure out a way to govern like a king, right? So this is what Orbán did in Hungary. This is what I think he's trying to teach Trump. I think the crucial thing, the crucial similarity is that in Project 2025, the main way that Trump is going to get control of the entire federal bureaucracy is by reclassifying a number of civil service employees as so-called at-will workers, which means they lose civil service protections and can be fired whenever, at will. And then they fire a whole bunch of civil service employees across the top of the bureaucracy. That was exactly what Orbán did in 2010. He changed the civil service law, fired a bunch of bureaucrats, and then he installed all of his own people. Now, what that means is that the prime minister in Hungary or the president in the U.S. can then just tell all of his own people, why don't you do this? Like, you can just directly order the bureaucracy to do things. Okay, now, why is that a problem? Well, we have a system in the U.S. where the president governs with the cabinet. The members of the cabinet need to be confirmed by the Senate. This system where Trump modifies the civil service law, installs his own people, and then directly orders them to do stuff means that Trump doesn't even need to go to the Senate for any confirmations. These are positions he plans to fill that do not require Senate confirmation, and therefore nobody to screen out people who may look too crazy even for moderate Republicans, for example. So that's the worry. That's how Orbán got direct control of the system. And Orbán eventually put a cabinet in place, but it really didn't do much. It was all cosmetic. He figured out a way to directly command the government, and that's what's in Project 2025. So again, if you think of the government as an instrument that can be put at the disposal of somebody who never wants to leave office, that's a very powerful tool. And it's in some ways much more powerful than the ideological things that many people think that Trump would borrow from Orbán. So Orbán is anti-woke. He claims to be running an illiberal democracy. He claims, he does all these in-your-face kind of rude things just to prove he can. He has this kind of Trumpish quality, as well as a lot of the concrete positions. But we've heard Trump change his mind a million times on almost everything he claims to stand for. And Orbán gives all these speeches in which he claims to have an ideology, and then you look at what he's actually doing, and he's not actually doing most of the things that he says. Basically, Orbán is an autocrat with a cover of conservative ideology. But the crucial thing is the core autocracy part, and that's the part that I see Trump and his people borrowing.
Now, do they still have elections in Hungary?
So, yeah, they still have elections. And here's, again, the brilliant invention of Orbán is that when you go to Hungary, it feels like a free country. The elections look like they're free. There's competition. There even looks like a chance with polls in advance of the election like somebody other than Orbán could win. But in fact, the system is rigged so that the rules determine the outcome rather than the votes. And this is something you see, again, the U.S. Republicans have worked toward this really going back 40 years, trying to figure out ways to disqualify voters who might vote for the other side, to make it harder to vote for those voters who might vote for the other side, to challenge election outcomes, as we saw with the last presidential, just to deny the election outcome and try to seize power by force. But a lot of it, the fake elector scheme that, was the way that Trump tried to stay in power last time, is a very legalistic strategy. And that's what Orbán models, is how to do all this while appearing to just be using the law, So Orbán looks like, Hungary looks like a democracy. Orbán looks like he's following the law. It's a hard dictatorship underneath, but because it has this cover, it kind of passes for a member of the European Union, passes for a member of NATO. It's in all of the exclusive clubs, looking like just a conservative elected democracy.
Now, are there term limits for president in Hungary?
No. So usually in prime ministerial systems, because the prime minister is elected by the parliament, there are no term limits. And, the leading example of a leader that you didn't mind not having a term limit was Angela Merkel, who stayed in power for 16 years because she kept, her party kept winning majorities in the parliament. So Orbán's been there 14 consecutive years now. All of his guys now wear these T-shirts that say, Orbán 2030. And they also have, Make Hungary Great Again T-shirts, by the way. Orbán's planning to stay for a while. And now in presidential systems like ours, usually there's a 2-term limit. And in fact, there's some important opinions of various kind of international soft law bodies that suggest 2 terms is enough. But, one of the questions here is whether Trump is just going to go blow right past that if he gets elected again. And that his people are already sort of talking about how to extend his term because, and the way that they would argue it is they say, well, the Constitution says no more than 2 terms in office, but it doesn't say more than 2, consecutive terms in office. Right. So the fact that Trump stepped out and came back again is giving his supporters already the constitutional, sort of arguments to say that Trump could stay for 2 more terms because the only prohibition is more than 2 consecutive terms.
Is the word consecutive in the amendment? I don't remember that.
No, it says 2 terms.
2 terms. I would imagine there'd be considerable pushback on the courts. But as you point out, if you own the courts and you've got a compliant court,
you capture the courts.
I mean, I know another argument that I've heard Trump float was that, well, my first term was so hampered by the Russia investigation that I wasn't able to really be president, so that shouldn't count. Which makes absolutely no sense. But, if just because it doesn't make sense to you and me doesn't mean it wouldn't make sense to a supine Supreme Court.
Well, this is it. So Orbán first captured the court, and then you realize that the Constitution is whatever the court says it is. And so if you have the court in your pocket, you can make all kinds of crazy constitutional arguments, and the court says fine. The court did this with the immunity case. The court did that with the presidential disqualification case. The Supreme Court did this yesterday with that crazy decision to allow the governor of Virginia to cut people from the voter rolls right before the election, despite the fact that there's a federal statute that says you can't cut anybody from the voter rolls, within 90 days of an election. Flat out violation. Like, it's even got a number like 90, which is not usually so interpretable, right? And so the governor tried it. The courts below all said, no, you can't do that. The Supreme Court said, yes, he can, which has just given, since yesterday, permission to all of the governors, all of the election officials across the country to start cutting the voter rolls like crazy because the Supreme Court is not going to enforce that rule.
Can you give me just a quick summary of the sort of conservative policy positions that Viktor Orbán has managed to push through that would frighten us here, having to do with church and state, abortion, gay rights, medical care, and things like that?
Yeah, so his Constitution protects life from the moment of conception. His Constitution says marriage is between a man and a woman, so no gay marriage. They've passed a law that says that any display of, gender fluidity to underage kids is banned. So any book that mentions, same-sex parents has to be barred from school libraries, and you can't show anything on television that would tend to show any same-sex couple, certainly not a trans person. So, yes, so all of that kind of stuff has passed in Hungary. Now, that said, Orbán is all about surface on this stuff, and he does not probe the depths. So fetuses have protection in the Hungarian constitution. The abortion law that Orbán inherited was not changed. There's a public harassment of, sort of gays in public, and yet Orbán didn't change the law that permits same-sex civil unions. So a lot of what Orbán's doing is modeling American conservatism for the Americans, but not actually changing the laws at home to make life miserable for his own people. So literally, a lot of Orbán's speeches are aimed at U.S. Republicans rather than aimed at his own population. So,
wow. Is there any press freedom over there? How about the media?
Okay. So this is interesting. So, we think about, the autocratic control of the media as, the police shutting down newspapers or, banning or having censorship rules or so on. So that's not how Orbán controlled the media. Instead, as you probably know, every traditional medium in the world is in some fiscal danger, right? Because the old business model doesn't work in an era of the internet. So what Orbán did was he withdrew all the state advertising from all the newspapers, radio, TV stations that had relied very heavily on state advertising. And then backstage, he starts threatening the advertisers to say, if we see you advertising on this channel or in this newspaper, you will never get a state contract ever again. And so the money to the opposition press dries up, or to the neutral press dries up. And then they all start failing, going into bankruptcy. And Orbán says, you see, this is happening all over the world. This is not our fault. Look, no hands. We didn't do it. And yet what this has resulted in is very, very few independent media still remaining. And there are a few, and the latest thing Orbán's done, starting last December, was that he created a new institution called the Sovereignty Protection Authority, which is supposed to check the public sphere for signs of foreign influence. And if you are a public figure, if you are a media company, if you're any company or a political party that participates in public discussion, if you take any money from foreign sources, you can be turned over for criminal prosecution because taking foreign money is banned. So this Sovereignty Protection Authority launched investigations into one of the last remaining investigative journalism outlets in Hungary. And just a few days ago, they came out with a report saying, you see, they're getting foreign money. It's because many people are, people outside the country are subscribing to it. And so now they've turned over the outlet so people for potential prosecution.
Oh, man.
They want to shut this investigative outlet down. So they've moved to much more repressive tactics after the economic ones failed to dissuade everybody.
Oh, man. Well, this has been terrifying, appropriately on Halloween. This is Professor Kim Lane Scheppele, a sociologist and international affairs expert at Princeton University. Thanks so much for this horrifying introduction to Viktor Orbán, and I hope not at all a look into our future here in the country. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Let's hope not. Well, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.